L'kutei Sichos Chelek Yotes, Esrim B'Av. Do I rush into a mitzvah to do the mitzvah as soon as possible, or do I look at how it will affect another yid, another person? This is the sikha that we're going to learn about. The topic is Korban Ha'etzim, the special korban that was brought by specific families when they would donate, or in honor of the fact that they donated wood to the Mizbeach. Esrim B'Av, the 20th of Av, is the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, Rav Agoin, Rav Chassid, V'chulu HaMekubal, Merino, Rav Levi Yitzchak Zal. The Rebbe's father was exiled by the Russian communists and passed away in the year 1944, Tavshin Dalid, in the city of Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan. The Rebbe doesn't mention that here, but on another occasion, at least one other occasion, the Rebbe said that the only time that Esrim B'Av is mentioned in the Gemara is with regards to Korban Ha'etzim, and this Sikha is going to be about that. Moshe viel mol geret wegen dem Tag von Esrim B'Av. We have already spoken about this many times. In L'kutei Sichos alone, there's two other Sichos before this one, and plus many other times that the Rebbe spoke about it that are not brought in L'kutei Sichos. About the day of Esrim B'Av, as das is einer von die tes Zmanim von Atzei Kayanim V'Am. This is one of the 10 times during the year, the 9 times during the year, the 9 times of the year which were recognized as the day of wood for the Kayanim and for the people. The Gemara in Tainus tells us, when the people came back from Galus, they did not find any wood in the lishka, in the room, in the storage room that was meant to keep the wood for the mizbeach. So certain families donated wood from their own wood, their own reservoirs. And therefore it was established as yeder von die mishpachas, that each of these families should celebrate this day annually, by bringing wood for the mizbeach, for the fire and the mizbeach on that day, and to use their wood for the mizbeach, even if the storage room of the wood at that time was already filled and there was other wood, nevertheless, to remember and to celebrate what that family did, that day they would bring their own wood and the Mizbeach would use their wood. The Tag is given a Yontif. That day was for this family, was this Yontif, a day of celebration. And the family, in addition to bringing wood, they would bring a Korban Eitzim, a carbon. Most opinions will say that this was like a carbon nedava that was brought to the base, to the Mizbeach, as thanking Hashem for this opportunity that they should be part of the Korban Ha'etzim. Now, if one of these times, now just say there was 9 times, which means there's 9 different families, and they had 9 different dates throughout the calendar. The Gemara in Tainus lists all the dates. Now, if any of these days, for example, in our case, we're talking about Esrim B'Av, is Chol b'Shabbos, it coincides with Shabbos. When we cannot bring the Korban Eitzim, weil is nicht durch Shabbos. The only karbanis that are durch Shabbos are karbanis tzibur, public karbanis for the public. This korban is considered a private korban because it was only from this family. So you can't bring it on Shabbos. So what do? State Mishnah as ma'achrin v'lei makdimin. The Mishnah says you postpone, but you don't bring it earlier, which means instead of bringing it on the day of Chof, which they can't because of Shabbos, they would bring it on Sunday, the next day, but not the day before Shabbos, not Friday. There are other cases, there are other instances where they're the same din, that you postpone rather than bring it early. The Mishnah lists Tisha B'Av, Chagiga v'Hakel. Tisha B'Av, if Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbos, you can't fast on Tisha B'Av, and therefore you fast on the following Sunday, not on the Friday or Thursday before Tisha B'Av. Chagiga, the Korban Chagiga, which is brought on Yontif, so either on Tesvav Nisan, or on Vav Sivan, or on Tesvav Tishrei. If that day is Shabbos, you bring it the next day, because since there's 7 days of Tashlumin to bring the carbon, you don't bring it on Shabbos, you bring it the next day. And the same thing is with Hakel, that the day of Hakel was Mitzvah Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag, the Mitzvah of the first day of Yom Tov. If that falls out on a Shabbos, you can't do Hakel. One of the reasons that's brought is because you have to bring everyone, the women and the children, and that's very difficult to do on Shabbos. And therefore, we postpone it to the next day. We don't do it a day earlier. Why? Why are we postponing it? Why not doing it as soon as we can? Maybe even earlier than we can. So, but again, let's to follow the Gemara with regards to the last few things listed in the Gemara, namely Tisha B'Av, Chagiga, and Hakel. Is the Gemara Masbir? The Gemara explains why we would postpone it and not do it earlier. With regards to Tisha B'Av, is Agdume Puranus Leimekadmi. We don't want to bring on the negativity sooner. Tisha B'Av, we're fasting and it's a day of sadness. We don't want to bring it on sooner than we have any sooner than we have to. Chagiga v'Hakel. With regards to Chagiga and Hakel, why don't we do it early? Mishum da'akati leimoti zman chiyuvayu. Because the time of its obligation has not yet arrived. It's not yet begun. The Chagiga is supposed to be brought on Yontiv. If it's out of Yontiv, it's not as man for Chagiga yet. You could bring in a Chedesh Tevis for that matter. In other words, it has the Chagiga has to be brought on Yontiv. Similarly with Hakel, the time of Hakel is to do it on Mitzvah Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag. If it's any earlier than that, it's not yet the Zman of the Chiyuv, and there's no purpose to do it. With regards to the carbon ha'etzim, steht nit in Gemara Kintam, the Gemara does not tell us a reason why. So the Gemara explains in Megillah. The Gemara explains why Tisha B'Av, Chagiga, and Hakel are postponed rather than done early. But with regards to the carbon ha'etzim, which is in that same Gemara, the Gemara doesn't say anything. Now, the Rebbe is going to tell us that Rashi does explain this. However, we find two explanations in Rashi that might be contradictory. We find a difference and possibly a contradiction between Rashi on the Gemara and Rashi on the Rif. In Ha'ara 8, the Rebbe points out that there's a very known discussion with regards to who authored the Pirush Rashi on the Rif. Was it actually written by Rashi, or was it written by someone else that collected from Rashi ala Shas and brought it to Rashi on the Rif and then added and removed some of the things that weren't relevant? Either way, the Rebbe says, we'd rather not create an argument, a dispute, a contradiction between Rashi on the Gemara and Rashi on the Rif. So we're going to learn the two Pirushim, and we're going to see, are they contradicting one another, or is there a way to reconcile them? In Gemara Rashi Mefarish, on the Gemara Rashi says like this: Akati leimoti zman chiyuvayu. This is a quote from the Gemara with regards to Chagiga and Hakel, that the time of the Chiyuv has not yet arrived. V'im yakdimuah, says Rashi, if they will bring the Chagiga or do Hakel any earlier, leyatzui dechivason, they won't fulfill their obligation. V'chein, Rashi says, and so too with regards to Atzei Kayanim, shekavua lohem zman kavua b'nedarim, that they have a designated time as a neder. Actually, in the Hagoyis on the Gemara, he changes the word to benidram, which means that it's not the Masechta Nedarim, it's because of their neder. Which means Rashi is learning that once they had vowed, once they had pledged to bring a carbon eitzim every year on Chof of, it becomes like a neder, that they have to do it on Chof of specifically, or each of the other 9 days, other 8 times, whenever the day was. And therefore they can't do it any earlier. The Seis says, is their time Rashi is saying that also by carbon ha'etzim, also the reason why it can't be brought any earlier is because the time of the Chiyuv has not arrived yet. In other words, the Chiyuv is specifically on Chof, on Esrim Ba'av in this case, because that was their promise, that was their pledge. And therefore, if they were to bring it a day earlier, they wouldn't fulfill their obligation. That's Rashi on the Gemara, as we're understanding it now. But Rashi on the Rif says something else. As ma'achrin ad achara Shabbos, you postpone until after Shabbos. Lefisha kol hayim shelev Shabbos manhu lemevi eitzim ad achshav. Because Friday until Shabbos, the time belongs to the previous family that was bringing the wood. And they don't want another family to infringe on their time. To bring wood and a carbon in a time that the previous people are still bringing. He says something. So the Pirush Rashi and the Riv says that there was another family that their time was Tesvav Ba'av, and they continued celebrating and bringing wood until Chaf Av. So Friday, which is Yud Tes Av in this scenario, the other family is still doing their thing, and therefore they don't want another family to start taking some of their time away, and that's why you can't bring it a day earlier. Und der Vater darf die Gemara nicht sagen, was man hat sie kennen warum der Tam was machen will magdimen. And Rashi over there continues that this is why the Gemara does not need to say the reason why we postpone the carbon ha'etzim instead of bringing it earlier. Because it's very simple and obvious. It's not your turn yet. If it's not your turn, you can't bring it yet. So now we have two explanations. We have the Pirush Rashi and the Gemara that says that the Chiyuv Ersh begins on the day of Esenim B'Av, and you can't bring it earlier because Leimoti Zman Chiyuvayu, the time of the Chiyuv, the time of the obligation did not yet begin. And then you have another explanation from Pirush Rashi and the Riv that day, Erev Shabbos, belongs to someone else. Unleitem tam kumtois, but according to this second reason, Pirush Rashi Alarif, that the reason is because of the other family. We could conclude as wenn der maybe Eitzim Adach wollten nicht geart, dass zweite Misbach so bringen Eitzim wir Carbon Eitzim in sein Mann. That if the other family didn't mind, that the new family should bring the wood and the carbon in their time. But Jäger can't make them sein dem Carbon Eitzim let of Shabbos. You would be able to bring it earlier net of Shabbos. Afal pi as akati le motas man chiyuvayu, even though the time of the chiyuv didn't begin. In other words, we're still holding on to this concept that the chiyuv begins on Esrim B'Av, because that was the pledge. That was the neder. The neder was that every year this family would bring wood on the 20th of Av. So the chiyuv begins on the 20th of Av. But according to the second understanding, according to the Pirush Rashi on the Rif, the only reason they can't bring it is not because the chiyuv didn't begin. The reason they can't bring it is because the other family doesn't want. But if the other family didn't mind, then even though the chiyuv didn't begin yet, you would still be able to bring the carbon ha'etzim early. So a very, very important point that the Pirush Rashi Alarif holds that you could bring something early even though the chiyuv didn't begin yet. Now later you'll see that by Chagiga this doesn't apply. But with regards to carbon ha'etzim specifically, or a carbon that a person pledged on their own will to bring, the fact that the Zman HaChiyuv didn't begin yet doesn't matter, and a person could still bring the carbon. In Sif Beis, the Rebbe is going to bring in a Ragid Shavar that applies this shita of the Pirush Rashi L'Rif, of the Pirush Rashi Elashas to another halacha and another machlekes in the Yerushalmi. This relevance between these two Pirush Rashi. in dem Fall le magdimin velakati le motis man chivayu adernit. Whether you say that because the time of the chiyuv has not yet arrived, you should not bring this early, or it doesn't matter, you could bring it earlier, is echnegei and anderen yanim. Will have an application in other ideas as well in other areas. And the Rebbe explains. In Yerushalmi is da plukt zwischen Amiroim. In the Gemara in Yerushalmi, there's an argument between the Amiroim. Is the person responsible for the tzedakah fund? The person who is distributing tzedakah, and there's no money in the account. Does he have an obligation to borrow money for a needy individual? Und how could he just borrow money? No, he's relying on a donation that's going to come in, that's going to be given later on. And the way I understand this is that he's relying on a donation that was promised on a specific day. So somebody had told him on Tesvav of, for example, I'm going to give you $1,000. I'll give you the tzedakah fund. Now today is Yud of. So he says, maybe I should borrow money. I know that on Tesvav of the money's coming in, so I'll pay back the lender with the money that's coming in. And there's machlekes in the Gemara Yerushalmi over there, whether you tell him lilvais or ain't lilvais. You tell him that he should borrow or he shouldn't borrow. Zog the Ragachaver. So the Ragachaver says as follows: as der Tam from der man the Omar ein emrim lilvais. The reasoning of the opinion that says to not borrow is verbunden mit dem Pirush Rashi l'shas anal, is connected with the Rashi and the Gemara that we just learned. Vu mizet. In this Rashi we see, as, and this is a quote from the Tzafnas Paneach from the Ragachaver, as ha'emer sheyavi karban lizman pleni, im hevi kaidim layatza. From the fact that it's that we learned that because the neder was on Chof of, therefore, until Chof of, he cannot bring the carbon. It's not yet the chiyuv. Hypothetically speaking, if he did, he wouldn't be yaitze. Similarly, if a person says, I'm going to bring a carbon adava, on Tesvav of, if he brings it on Yud Dalid or on Yud Gimel before Tesvav, he's not Yaitza, because the day of the Neder is part of the fulfillment of the Neder. Valderech says, Beniten and Alfon Tzedakah, says the Ragachaver, that the same thing could be applied to the mitzvah of Tzedakah, to this question, to this machlekes in Yerushalmi. Does was der Gabbai Tzedakah turned lying kishein bekis? The fact that according to this opinion, the Gabbai Tzedakah is not allowed to borrow if he has no money in the account, is weil mit nicht nutzen die Tzedakah Geld, was man wird später menadev sein und bekommen auf zu abzahlen dem Chef frier. Because he holds that you can't use the donation that's going to come later to repay a loan that was taken earlier. Weil demol wird auskommen as niskayim tzedakah kedem zman kviyus aneder. Because if you were to do that, then it would mean that you're fulfilling the tzedakah, you're giving the tzedakah before the designated time of the promise. If a person said, I'm going to give it on Tezvav of, and then on Yud of, you gave the ani, the poor money, the poor person, the money based on what's coming in on Tezvav. So for all intents and purposes, you gave the ani, this guy's money on Yud. And his promise was to give it on Tezvav. And if you can't give a carbon earlier than the day you promised it, then you can't give tzedakah. You can't fulfill your pledge of tzedakah earlier than you promised it. The mitzvah tzedakah hat sich angetan far dem Zman, was der nächsten Keveya menade de Geld auf tzedakah. The mitzvah of tzedakah is being done, is being fulfilled by giving the ani nitzrich, by giving the needy individual before the time that the giver, that the donor had a pledge to give it. So if you're just repaying a loan that was taken earlier, they're mentioned the person who promised to give it on a specific day does not fulfill his promise. This is how the Ragachaver learns. This is what he's saying is that when you're using the donation to repay a loan, then basically, when was the tzedakah given? On Yud Av, on an earlier day. If we understand, according to Pirush Rashi Alashas, that Lo Matiz Man Chiyuvayu, you can't bring the carbon ha'etzim before the day that it was pledged to be given on, and therefore we learn that you can't give a carbon before the day that you pledged to give it on. You can't give tzedakah on that. So you can't fulfill your neder. Of course, you can give as much tzedakah as you want, but the neder to give on a certain day isn't fulfilled before that day comes. And therefore, the man de Amar, I think it's Rav Ami, says ein lilvos. He can't do it. He can't rely on that donation because that donation has to be given on Tezvav and then given to an ani on Tezvav and later. But according to what we said earlier, that this is be'etzem a machloikis between, it seems to be a machloikis between Rashi al-Ashas and Rashi al-Arif, that according to Rashi al-Ashas you can't give it a day early, and according to Rashi al-Arif you could give it a day early. That would mean that according to Rashi al-Arif, also in the case of the tzedakah, you could tell the Gabbai tzedakah to borrow money and rely on a donation coming later. Lefiza kumtu says like Pirush Rashi Lerif as Lule says was the Friedrich Misbacha Vilnichi comes to his manum. Volma gemerkt macht him sein the carbon ha'etzim, that if not for the fact that the other family would have didn't want others to infringe on their time, you would be allowed to bring the carbon ha'etzim a day early. Even though this is before the time that the neder established, and therefore the obligation really didn't start. Then this reasoning doesn't apply that which the Mandamar says to not borrow, because you could do so. You could give tzedakah early and fulfill the pledge that you made to give tzedakah a little bit later. So we've established a machlekes between Rashi al Shas and Rashi al Rif, which is not just about carbon eitzim, but it's about the general concept of, can I give a carbon earlier than the day I promised, and can I fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah if my tzedakah is going to a loan that was taken out earlier? It seems to be a machlekes, and we don't want it to be a machlekes. So the Rebbe is going to try. The Rebbe is going to explain to us that this is not really a machlekes. And really, the two Rashis are actually complementing one another. And in order to do that, the Rebbe is going to ask a question on the second Pirush, on the Pirush Rashi al Rif, Sif Gimel. And Pirush Rashi al Rif, and now we'll understand this by first introducing a question on the Pirush Rashi al Rif. As misdit maktim dem carbon eitzim le'erev Shabbos, that we do not bring the carbon eitzim earlier on Erev Shabbos. Well, thus there's man from them, maybe eitzim ad achshav, because that time belongs to the family that was bringing the carbon eitzim up until this point. The ein number eitzim sheikon to his man, and they don't want people to infringe on their time. The lechayr is that movement seemingly this is not understood. Why is the other person's interest irrelevant here? Das kvius mar carbon eitzim is given durch the neviim. Das bezdin. The time of the carbon eitzim was designated by the Nevi'im of that time, which is considered Das Bezdin. The Bezdin established that this is how it would be. When Eibus at Kanart Meraktim on the carbon eitzim instead of Shabbos, and if it's okay, if there's not a problem with Lemati's Man Chiyuvayu, if it's okay to bring the carbon eitzim out of Shabbos, we shouldn't be taking into consideration the previous family. The Bezdin should have decided and designated what to do. Now, if it's a problem of Lemati's Man Chiyuva, you can't bring it because it's not yet a Chiyuv, so what, the Bezdin can't change that. If it's not the Chiyuv, it's not the Chiyuv. But if the problem isn't of Lemati's Man Chiyuvayu, and according to them, you could bring it early, it's just we're trying to be nice to the other family, let Bezdin establish that this is how it's done, and this is how it's done. If the right thing to do is to bring it earlier, and we're just not doing it because of the other family, why would we take that into consideration? In other words, if you're saying that this is something that happens every year, in other words, that as we look at the time, year after year, whenever it would fall out on Shabbos, all of a sudden we have to figure out, do they want, do they not want? It does not seem to make sense that way. L'chayre was established in the beginning how it should be done, and that's how it should be done. So why couldn't they establish it right away in the proper way? Siv Dalet, v'yesh levayer. So therefore, we can explain. As the zwei Pirush Rashi and Nit Bistire Zelazah, the two Pirush Rashi do not contradict one another. Nor Adarabah, quite the contrary, einer is mashlim dem zweiten, one complements the other. Ubehaktim, and let us preface the following idea. Der Chiyuv HaMishpach is bizman atzei kernim va'am, bavoas carbon eitzim is mitzad din neder. The fact that there's an obligation on the families to bring the carbon eitzim in a specific time is because of the din of neder. In other words, really, why would they be obligated to do anything? They did it. They did it once. They did it twice. They did it 3 times. What creates a annual obligation? The din of neder. In other words, once a person does something once, twice, 3 times, it doesn't say bli neder. Especially if they did make a promise and they did establish to do it in a certain way, it becomes an obligation. Was bei neder darf man sich rechnen, wie es ist gewähnt, das hanoider, b'shas hat gemacht im neder. When it comes to nedarim, we have to take into consideration also what was in the mind of the person making the promise. The Rebbe references the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, where he discusses over there that when a person makes a neder, we, Bezdin, has to take into consideration the circumstances of the person, why he made the neder, and so on and so forth, in order to understand what is the extent and the parameters of this neder. Because the das hanoider, what's going through his mind, even the person says something, I'm not going to wear wool. Those are the words he said. But what's in his mind actually is relevant to the extent of the neder. So that's very important. The chiyuv here is based on the din of neder. And when it comes to neder, it's not absolute, but rather the person's thoughts when making the neder are extremely relevant. Und wie bald das ist ein Davar Aragilu B'Yeser. As ein der other kama from the test manim and Chol b'Shabbos, and since it would be very common that one of these 9 days, the 9 various different days of the Korban HaEitzim would coincide with Shabbos, is gewiss haben die Menadvim lechatchile gehad b'deyer, wenn soll sein die Akravas HaKorban k'Chol b'Shabbos. So certainly those who were donating at first, the first time around, they certainly had in mind what they would want to do if the day of bringing the korban coincides with Shabbos. Free or others better. Should they bring it earlier or should they bring it later? In other words, the neder was that they're going to bring korban eitzim, let's say a chafaf. But they must have had in mind, if they're planning to do this in the future, what's going to happen if it's Shabbos. So what was in their mind? So the Rebbe says, Rashi al-Arif is telling us what's in their mind. Und das ist was der Pirush Rashi al-Arif is meisiv bir. In the Pirush Rashi l'Shas, and this is where Rashi on the Rif adds an understanding to Rashi on the Shas. That which Rashi says, that when a korban ha'etzim is not yet on the before Chof of or any of the other days, it's not yet this man of the chiyuv. It says nit nor balas is kedem yema Shabbos. This man chiyuv from Shara Shonim. It's not just because Friday is Yotes, which is before Chof, which is before the chiyuv begins for in any other year. Not in dem Fall is this man chiyuvayu hebt sich erst on noch Shabbos. If Chof of falls out on Shabbos, then the time of the chiyuv begins after Shabbos. That's what Rashi means to say. When Rashi says it's not yet the chiyuv, it's not because it's Yotes and not Chof, but because it's Friday and it's not after Shabbos. Because since the other family wouldn't want or might not want that they should infringe on their time, is das hanoider, die spededike mispacha, milechatchile given. So the second family, the family that's coming in Chof, they're in their mind from the get-go was as wenn zain's man v'chol zain b'Shabbos, that if his time will be on Shabbos, so when bringing them korban eitzim noch Shabbos, they would bring this korban after Shabbos. The godel hashalom, because shalom is so important. Ubefrat ben yonim mizbeach for korban, certainly when it comes to the mizbeach and korbanos, which the whole idea of korbanos is to create shalom to this world and the other world, and so on and so forth. And therefore, certainly, the Das HaNoider, the family, the Chof of family, knew that the other family may not want it, and therefore they had in mind when they made the neder that if it falls on Shabbos, they're going to bring it on Sunday. And when Rashi says Leimoti Zman Chiyuvayu, he doesn't mean because it's Yotes. He means because it's not yet after Shabbos. Because this family would not have wanted it to be done, the second family would not have wanted it to be done on Friday, so as not to hurt the previous family. So the two Rashis are actually working together. Rashi and Shas is telling us the idea of Limati Zman Chiyuvayu, and Rashi al-Arif is explaining to us why not. Because since it's totally in Das HaNoider, and Das HaNoider certainly did not want to do something that would hurt the other family, and therefore they had in mind to bring it on Shabbos, to bring it on Sunday. Then the Rebbe adds a very, very important thing. It's important because it's going to be relevant to what the Rebbe concludes with at the end of the Sikha. If not for the fact that the previous family would not want their time to be infringed upon, is Mistaber Leimer as das Haneder wold given as man darf gemacht im sein sehr Korbanetzim. It's logical, it's sensible to say that the das Haneder, the family, would have wanted to actually bring it earlier. In other words, for this case, sake of Shalom, they pushed it to Sunday. But if that wasn't an issue, then they probably would have wanted to bring it on Friday. Why? Let of Shabbos, Vayil Aleph, mitzvah bo liot chal tach mitzena. Number one, a mitzvah that you have an opportunity to do now. You should not let go of that opportunity. The Chazal teach us that if you have a chance to do a mitzvah, do it right away. Base. And another point, im timtze leimar. According to those opinions, as nutzen zeide eitzim korban sibur is given bismanoi, that they still use their wood for their karbanis sibur. There's certain karbanis, the tmidim, the musafim, that were brought on Shabbos. They also needed wood. Whose wood did they use? So some of the opinions say that they would use on Shabbos, Esrim B'Av, they would use the wood of the new family because the other family was done. Even if it's on Shabbos, you still use their wood. You can't bring the carbon on Shabbos, but the wood could be used. Kumtuis, that would mean, as a meleked up them carbonates is noch Shabbos, if you were to postpone the carbonates till after Shabbos, Geita durchatog, a day passes, was a danking the demebischen for them that the wood is being used, and they're not thanking Hashem in the traditional way for the merit, for the privilege of bringing the eitzim. So had they had the choice, they would have chosen to bring it on Friday. So by the time their wood is being used on Shabbos, they're already celebrating and they're thanking Hashem for the schus. So the only reason why they're not doing it on Friday is because of what Rashi Alariv says, they don't want to hurt the other family. And this is why this is an obvious thing that you would have to postpone and not do early. When the Gemara is going to and the Gemara doesn't even need to address it. Even if in the later years there will be a family that will agree to bring the carbon in their time on Friday, you still don't do it. The fact that now this is not yet as Zman HaChiyuv is as weil der Chiyuv das HaNeder is melachatchila af ma'achrim, because the mindset of the original promisers was to postpone it, and therefore they can't do it early because that would be going against the das HaNeder, and that's not the neder. The neder is based on the mind of the person or people who made the neder, and you can't go against that, and therefore it's a davar hapashut. The Gemara doesn't have to explain why, because that's what the neder wanted. Now the Rebbe is going to go back to the Ragachover. The Ragachover said that according to Rashi Alarif, according to Rashi Alashas, you can't bring a carbon early, and therefore you can't bring a donate. You can't be yotza a donation early, and therefore you can't borrow on that pledge. Now the Rebbe is going to argue with the Ragachover. Is lefia nias daiti euch nit talking raya von dem din zu der plukt to say a little bit with the Ragachover zok nasif base. The way we're learning it, that be'etzem geret. Hey, we're learning it that the neder, as we see it, is totally b'das hanoider. It's because this is what the noider wanted, that it should be brought on Sunday, not on Friday. You can't learn from here to the case of the tzedakah. The fact that you can't bring it early in our case is because that's what the mind, that's what the promiser wanted. To delay and not to bring it early. So we can't learn from that case to a different case. In that case, the case that the Ragachover was talking about, or the case of the Yerushalmi, the Noider would not have taken into consideration a very unusual case. Can they borrow money on and relying on his donation? To be able to learn from that whether you could use the tzedakah before the time that the person who pledged intended to give it. It's two very, very different cases. Over there, we don't think that the guy had anything in mind. And the Rebbe brings in the Hara that probably on the contrary, probably if he did think about it, he would have said, if it helps someone, why not? He wanted to give it on a certain day. Doesn't mean necessarily that maybe he didn't have it until then or whatever it was. But if someone could benefit earlier from that tzedakah, he probably didn't mind. But the idea over here, what the Rebbe says in the Pnima Sikha, is that he didn't think about it. So in our case, the case of the Karbana Eitzim, they did think about it. And their decision was to postpone it, not to hurt the other person. But to learn from there that in every single case you can't bring it early, even if the person didn't want to bring it early, you can't compare those two things. So the Rebbe is disagreeing with the Ragachover. The Ragachover is learning this Rashi and applying it to say that therefore you ain't Oimrim Lilvos. You can't, obviously the halacha, by the way, is not like that. The halacha is the Oimrim Lilvos. But that isn't relevant to here. The discussion was what is the opinion of the person that says Ein Eimrim Lilvos. So the Ragachover wanted to explain that he's going in with the Rashi that you can't bring it early. But according to the Rebbe explained that the whole reason why Leimatis Manchi Yuvayu is because of the Das HaNoider. In that case, you can learn from there to another case where we don't know what the Das HaNoider is, or the Das HaNoider didn't think about it because it's a very unusual situation. And now in Sifrei, the Rebbe brings a very practical application to the minig of giving tzedakah on a yard site. And if the yard site is on Shabbos, should you give the tzedakah earlier or later? From this we can also apply to a case of a yard site that falls on Shabbos. There's a custom to give tzedakah on the day of a yard site. Similarly, many places, some places have a custom to fast on the day of a yard site. This becomes a neder. Once a person does this and he gives tzedakah on the yard site, it becomes a neder. It becomes something that he's obligated to do. So you could ask the same question. Shabbos. Should you give the tzedakah earlier before the yard site and of Shabbos? Or should you give the tzedakah after Shabbos on Sunday? According to the Ragachavar, the way he understood the Rashi and the way he applied it to the Gemara in the Yerushalmi, it would seem that you should postpone this tzedakah until after you pass the time that the neder begins. The neder only becomes applicable on the day of the yard site. And therefore, you have to wait at least until the day of the yard site. And if you can't give it on that day because it's Shabbos, you give it the next day. But according to the Rebbe's explanation, that it's totally b'das hanoider, it's totally in the mind of the person that makes the neder. It's understood as the yard site that since a person knows that the yard site will fall out in some years on Shabbos, is the neder melechatchila in an oifen. So we have to say that the person who took upon himself to give tzedakah every year on the yard site, it must be that he had in mind to do so in a way shekarav yesel leiras Chazal, which would be as close as possible to the teaching of Chazal as mitzvah haba liyada altach mitzvah, that if you have a chance to do a mitzvah, do not let it go. Of Shabbos, we should give this tzedakah earlier on the Erev Shabbos. Do the mitzvah as soon as possible and not wait until after Shabbos. So this is the practical application, according to the way that Rebbe understands this Rashi of Leimatis Manchi Yuvayu, is because of the Das HaNoider, because of the Neder Melechatchila was based on not hurting someone's feelings, and therefore it was pushed off till after Shabbos. But if you don't have that scenario, then obviously you should revert back to the classic teaching of Chazal to not push off a mitzvah, and therefore not only that, the Rebbe says more than that. The Rebbe says that the Das HaNoider in this case, in the case of the yard site, what was he thinking? Obviously, he was thinking to give it earlier because mitzvah balot chatach mitzvah. So a person has a minig to give tzedakah on a yard site, and the yard site falls on Shabbos. Obviously, he always intended to give it earlier when he had to, and you could give the mitzvah on you give the tzedakah on Erev Shabbos and fulfill your neder of giving tzedakah on the day of the yard site.